Okay. Welcome to Israel 365 and Bring Them Home organization sponsoring another great week webinar live from Jerusalem and Telstone with Rabbi Pinchas Winston. And the subject matter today is going to be, the title is Recognizing Yosef, but we hope that the rabbi will also be speaking about current events and the redemptive process. And when we conclude, we'll give you all the information about his website and our website. So please, without further ado, this is Rabbi Pinchas Winston.
Thank you once again. Where to begin? Obviously at the beginning, but not actually at the beginning. The middle sometimes is also good too. What I want to do, I'm talking to a screen basically. I'm actually talking to myself. I see myself over here, but I don't know who's watching. I don't know people's backgrounds. I don't know. It's a little bit different. You're talking live to people, and you can look at faces and see who's getting it and who's okay with it, who's upset with it, and then try and mend fences along the way. It's a little bit different when you're talking to a shower curtain, for the most part. But what I'd like to do is present a perspective, a very important perspective, especially from a historic perspective, that has to do with what's going on today and has had to do with what's going on today every day for the last 3,000 some odd years. And then we'll see how it goes from there, Rosh Hashem. But like I said, I don't know how people respond to it, how they react to it, what they think, But all I ask is just to hear out the points and to think about it, because we've been at crossroads for some time, very big crossroads. But it's important to have perspective, and I'll tell you why right now. Because let's go back to the beginning. Right, literally the beginning. Right, the beginning of the Torah. It says, "Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim es haaretz." Right, in the beginning, God made the heaven and the earth. Famous. We don't need to talk about that one. And then the next verse says, "Va'aretz haisa tovavo b'choshech al pnei tehom v'ruach Elokim merechepes al pnei hamayim." That the earth was null and void, and there was darkness upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered above the water. And you have this image in mind of, it's dark, it's like a swamp, it's black, it's gloomy. Creation is in its nascent state, and, God's just like ready to go. It's like the building blocks are there, and he's hovering over it like a construction worker, like seeing all the materials. What can we do with this? How are we going to put this over here? And then, boom, he starts to, God said let there be light. There was light, and then there was the sea splitting it, or the division of the land and the sea, and et cetera, et cetera. It's all there at the beginning of Bereshis. And Rashi, who is one of the main commentators on the Torah, probably the foremost commentator on the Torah, speaks about different things, but doesn't talk about that second verse so much, and neither does the Ramban, Nachmanides, or a lot of other commentators. They don't bring down what the Medrash says. The Medrash takes that second verse and interprets it, not making something up. It's a tradition. Moshe was told by God at Mount Sinai, this is what that verse means. And that became part of the Medrash. Some of the Medrashim were perhaps added over time, and you can more or less tell when they're more recent, because they're talking about more recent times. But this particular explanation, you can consider to be part of the oral law that goes back to Moshe. God told Moshe, this is what this verse means. And so what does it mean? So the Medrash elucidates and says, the first term is tohu, not to be confused with tofu. That's a food. Tohu is a completely different thing, and it really means null. It's translated as null or chaos. Tohu often means chaos, and the Medrash says that's an allusion to Galus Bavel, the Babylonian exile. Now you have to have context over here. There's not even Adam Harishon, the first man, has not yet been created, and let's say he was created, and then he didn't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil until Shabbos, the first Shabbos, which would have been a mitzvah. Then all of us, whoever we would be born and created, in the Garden of Eden, and that's where we wouldn't need this class tonight. We'd be doing other things instead on a much higher level. So why is the Medrash talking about an exile of a people that's only going to exist because he's going to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then history is going to unfold, and there's going to be an Avraham and a Yitzchak and Yaakov and the 12 tribes and the Jewish people exile. The whole story that's in the Chumash. You see it there, right? So obviously God knew in advance. There's lots of explanations for this particular point, but anyhow, that's what the Medrash says. Galus Babel, the very first exile the Jewish people are going to enter. And it's a historical fact. You can go back and you can see that the Jewish people had their first commonwealth after they left Egypt, and they build up the country and they build the first temple. And then Nebuchadnezzar becomes the king of Babylonia, and he's conquered. In those days, nations built up and conquered the world. That was the in thing. That was the fad in those days, right? That was build up a country and conquer the world. That's what everyone seemed to like to do. That was like the pastime. And so they also were doing the same thing. They tried to make Israel into a vassal state, and eventually things didn't work out the way they might have. And instead he attacked the Jewish people, attacked the country, exiled the Jewish people into Babylonia. So they stayed there for altogether 70 years. Babylonia is conquered by Persia, so the exile changes hands at some point in time. The Jewish people don't change location, but the exile, the masters of the Jewish people, that changes. And then, of course, you have the story of Purim. The story of Purim is about how the Babylonian exile came to an end. Haman came and did his thing, and that's a whole story to itself. And then Mordechai and Esther, and what this fantastic miracle, and we celebrate every year Purim coming up, got really about a month and a half or so, and that was the first exile. And the Vohu, in that verse we're talking about for the creation, it says that's the Median exile, which was the continuation of the Babylonian exiles. The Babylonian exile itself lasted 52 years. That one lasted 18 years and 70 years altogether. Okay, fine. The Jewish people come back. Then we eventually go back to the land. Not everybody. A lot of people stay in Babylonia, otherwise known as Bavel in Hebrew, but many do go back, and they start building the second temple, but it doesn't really go too far. It's Herod who will later on complete the temple. They run into all kinds of problems and snags and enemies along the way. It slows the process down completely. But the Choshech part of the verse, the Medrash elucidates and says it's talking about Greece, the Greek exile, because Alexander will also go to conquer the world at some point in time and spread across Asia, and eventually enter to Israel as well. And he comes more or less on friendly terms. 180 years later, we have the miracle of Hanukkah, because in the meantime, the Greeks became not friendly towards the Jewish people. A lot of assimilation, and eventually the tremendous pressure on the Jewish people not to keep Torah mitzvahs. They tried to Hellenize us. Some people fought back eventually, the Hashmonaim, and that resulted in the victory over the Greeks against the odds, and that became the holiday of Hanukkah. That's the second exile. That's a third exile, pardon me. And then the Tahom, right, the darkness upon the face of the deep. So, that's like deep. It's long. Deep implies very, very long. So that's an allusion, says the Medrash, to the Roman exile, really called Edom, because Esav is Edom, and Rome comes from Esav, but we call it the Roman exile for all intents and purposes. And that one goes on and on and on. It's so deep, it's so long, and that one basically officially began in 63 BCE when Pompey came in and conquered Yerushalayim and took control. He was invited in there's a civil war going on at that time in the Hashmonaim family, but eventually Rome came and they took over, and that became the Roman exile that lasted and is still going on more or less. But some say that since Kristallnacht actually took place 2,000 years into the year since Pompey came into Yerushalayim, that was officially the end of the Roman exile, because anyhow, that was the pretty much the end of the European exile, which is really Edom spread out across Europe. And although America also comes from that, that's a kind of part of the whole thing. So I would say it's not over. But anyhow, that's the second verse of creation, describing 4 exiles of the Jewish people. Ruach Elokim, the Spirit of God hovered above the water. That Zu Ruach Mashiach. That's the Spirit of Mashiach. It's God preparing for not just the redemptions along the way, but the final redemption, which incorporates our period of history, because we're waiting for that right now, God willing. And hopefully it will happen very soon in our time. So that's the second verse. Now, that's not the only place where this shows up. This shows up also in Yaakov's dream of the angels in the ladder. So, one angel goes up, 52 rungs and comes back down again. That's the Babylonian exile, but that's the angel of Babylonian that does the climbing and descending. Then comes one for 18 rungs on the ladder. And then comes one for 180, the Greek, etc. And then the Roman one goes up and up and up and up and up and up. And almost seems like he's not going to come down, but the Medrash says he does come down eventually after a long, long, long time. Again, an allusion to the 4 exiles. And that's Jewish history until Mashiach comes. Like exiles and redemption, there's good times and bad times, but a lot of exile along the way. We've been exiled for over 2,000 years now. We've been a nation for 3,320 some odd years, since, let's say, Mount Sinai. You go back to Egypt a little bit longer, and 2/3 of that at least has been in exile. And the redemptions don't really last all that long, considering how much time we've had to spend in exile. So where do we fit into all of that? So we're way late in history at this point in time, and we're so far from the time of prophets. Prophecy actually literally existed. I mean, the Gentile
Okay. I apologize for that technical interruption. We are back, and I hope that you can just start off where you left off. Do you know where you were when we got knocked off?
No, I don't. More or less.
Okay.
Anyhow, we'll just pick up from here. In this week's parsha, you have a very, very important point. It's a point that unfortunately that it's so important that so many people, they don't really pay attention to it, and it's so crucial in terms of understanding the whole concept of exile and redemption, and our role in it, and how to look at the events of any generation and at any time. Because there's no difference today. If you were to go back to Babylonia and stood there amongst the people, not knowing that you came from the future and you were just one of the people back then, so then history would be what it was back then. It wouldn't be like, oh, that's ancient times. We're living now in biblical times, and the future will be that you didn't think like that. You're part of the events of the day, and you thought in those terms. Likewise, when it came to the Greek exile, that was the mentality, that was the headspace, and the Roman exile. And if we go back to 1930 Germany and look at the Jews and how they looked at the world at that time, and living in Germany, 100,000 Jews chose to stay in Germany as opposed to make Aliyah, and the German Nazi party was prepared to allow them to do this at the beginning. They chose instead to stay in Germany because from their perspective, things were going to get better, not worse. They didn't see Hitler as a megalomaniac necessarily, or that it was going to spell imminent danger for the Jewish people and result in the Holocaust. Because if they thought that, they would have run the other direction. 64,000 Jews left because they saw the writing on the wall, so to speak, as Daniel did in his time. And 100,000 German Jews said, no, we're just as German as the next Jew. And the reason why they felt that way was because living at that time, seeing what was going on, seeing how Hitler was a man of the people, who that's what he framed himself, and that's how people perceived him. The Weimar Republic had failed. The economy, inflation was horrific, and they were looking for a savior. And many professors at that time wrote that they actually looked at Hitler as a Mashiach type figure, a messianic figure, because that's the way it looked to them at that time, with their perspective, with their mentality. And it's, when there's an expression in Judaism, well, actually not just in Judaism, but I think in every language pretty much, that you can't judge another person until you stand in their shoes, which means basically that, yeah, it's easy to have, hindsight and look back and see things clearly, but if you're standing there at the time, and that's your whole reality, not you're from the future, you travel back in time knowing how things are going to unfold at some, even though you're living now in the present, but this is going to lead to that. This is your present, and your future is part of this reality. So you see things a certain way. And it blinds people. So this week's Parsha, it starts off at the beginning talking about how Yosef and his brothers had died off. It's a whole different generation. And then the Torah says, V'yakam melech hadash. A new king arose over Egypt. Yakim melech hadash al eretz Mitzrayim, v'lo yadas Yosef, who did not know Yosef. That's what the verse says. A new king who rose up, became the new Pharaoh. And the Torah makes a point of telling us, and he didn't know Yosef. Why? Why do I need to know that detail? What's important about that particular fact that he didn't know Yosef? So Rashi, he picks up on this, and the Talmud picks up on this, and before Rashi, and they explain this is an insight. This is telling us something. What's it telling us? So it's a disagreement amongst the commentators whether or not it was in fact the new Pharaoh, or it was the same one with a new attitude, different attitude. What does that mean? So the Medrash says that what happened really back at that time, that the God blessed the Jewish people that they should have 6 children at one time. So the population exploded overnight. All of a sudden, all these Jewish children were being born. A tremendous blessing, yes? Well, interesting enough, it didn't work out that way. Why? Because even though the numbers increased, that raised, red flags for the Egyptian nobility. They watched the Jewish people expand in size, and Medrash says they were worried about a war with the land of Canaan, which they thought was going to happen at some point in time. And if that happened, since the Jewish people came from Canaan, they would align themselves and be like a 5th column inside of Mitzrayim. So the nobility turned to Pharaoh and said to him, you have to deal with these people before they become, a danger to us. And then the whole story starts to begin. So first Pharaoh says, no. He says, no, are you kidding? These people came from Yosef. You know what Yosef did for our country? How he saved us from starvation and made us the wealthiest country in the world because everybody had to pay money to come get food because of Yosef's insight, because of his connection to God? And you want me to turn on him and his family's descendants? No way. So he said, have it your way. And they kicked him out of office. He lost his job. And like a lot of good politicians, where, push come to shove, he basically said, okay, after 3 months, he returned to his job and he made himself like a new king. In other words, he had to pretend as if he did not know what Yosef had done so he could live with his conscience. And that's how Rashi explains it. That's what the Medrash explains it. But it works, but it also falls short because, who cares? Really, I mean, it's interesting, and it's a detail, it's a fact, and maybe put the whole thing into the Medrash, how it happened. But why does the Torah put this little piece of information in here? Because Torah is Morah, it comes to teach us something, and at such a crucial moment in history, it seems literally like the entire exile in Egypt is hinged on this one particular point, that the new Pharaoh did not know Yosef. Why would that be so central? Why would that be so crucial? So the Talmud says, and it's well known, that God works midah keneged midah, measure for measure. What does that mean? It means that when God does things, we call it punishment, but the truth is that punishment is not really for this world. It comes later on. It's more like consequence of the choices and the actions that we take and the choices that we make. So God will work measure for measure if we make it for both, good and bad. But if it for bad, the reason why is because he wants us to learn from our mistakes. So if the crime, if the punishment doesn't fit the crime, you can't learn what the crime was. So therefore, God will always try to, he can always do what he wants, but always try to connected up so that when we go through whatever we go through, we can say, well, what caused that? I don't want to go through that again. So whatever I did, bit my tongue, I spoke Lashon Hara, derogatory speech about somebody else. Okay, there's a connection there. Don't do that. You don't like biting your tongue, so don't do that. So what was it that Lo Yades Yosef, that he did not hear Yosef, that was so critical that had to be fixed up, as if to say, this is what the exiles come in to fix up. That Lo Yades Yosef, that Pharaoh, no, not Pharaoh. Pharaoh is just an instrument. He's a vehicle. In fact, the best way to lose your free will is to become a public leader. And the higher up, the more it's true. But there are verses that say that God works through the leaders. He kind of takes over them to some degree. But you have to understand, he doesn't make people evil and doesn't make people good. You have to decide to be that way, and then God will use you for good or use you for evil. It depends upon what choice a person makes, not just the leaders, but everybody in general. So if Pharaoh's doing this, it's in response to something that we already did. We're not rectifying him. We're being rectified ourselves. The whole point of the Egyptian exile is to rectify the Jewish people, to perfect them into the nation they have to become to be God's emissaries here on earth. So where didn't we know Yosef? Oh, but once you ask that question, it's like clear, absolutely clear. In fact, just go back one parsha. We'll go back a few parshas in the end, but start with one parsha. Go back to Parshas of Yechi, last week's parsha, right? What happens? At the end of the parsha, Yosef has already revealed himself. The family has moved down to Mitzrayim. Everything is mesudar. It's all organized and arranged, and and then Yaakov dies. He lives the last 17 years of his life. Right? He doesn't die. We spoke about this last week. He just transitions to a higher level of reality, but he's not here anymore. He's not involved in the affairs of his family, not directly, not from down here. So at that point in time, a very interesting but critical thing takes place. What's that? So Yosef's brothers, for whatever reason, and it gives a reason, but for Yosef's brothers, they're worried that maybe Yosef will take revenge against them. So they tell Menashe to go talk to his father and say that their father told them to tell him not to take revenge against him after he dies. They lie. They made that up. Yosef knows that. And then Yosef cries. Before he cries, he said, am I in place of God? Come on, let's get with the program over here. We spoke about this. We went through this before, right? That I can't harm you if God doesn't want you to be harmed. I can't save you if God wants to kill you. It's all in God's hands. It's all in the hands of heaven, but the fear of God, that's what the Talmud says. It's a principle. And you tried to sell me to the first thing I told you after I revealed myself was this very point. Don't worry, I'm not angry, I'm not spiteful, I'm not going to take revenge. I recognize that this was the hand of God to save all of us. He sent me down here. You wanted to sell me, that was your intention, but it was all God, the whole way God. I said, don't worry. And now they're going to come and say to Yosef, our father told us to tell you, etc., etc., etc. And Yosef says, no way. Because our father knew me through and through. And he knew not one jealous bone, not one vengeful bone in my body. He knows I would never lift a finger against any of you. He knows that I'm real with the divine providence that brought me here, put me in this position. So you're making that up. I understand. You're afraid, but you're making that up. And then he cries. Says Yosef cries. Yeah. So why is he crying? You hurt my feelings? Such a big person? It's like, you hurt my feelings? No. Because he says that statement, that little statement there, you don't know me. You don't know me. If you knew me, you would never feel compelled to say that. The fact that you could suspect me of taking revenge means that you don't know me. And for that reason, Pharaoh will come later on, and also not measure for measure. That doesn't begin there. And we still have to answer the question, so what? Okay, so then Yosef, why should a whole nation of people be punished because his brothers don't, I don't recognize my brother as something, so therefore everyone has to suffer because of that? That's just the beginning of the story. But that's what happens over here. Now this goes back a little bit further. Because in Parshas Miketz, after divine providence sets it up that there's a famine, because there doesn't have to be a famine. God made there be a famine so that Yosef could go down and be, and the whole thing would happen the way it happened, right? It's all part of God's providence and master plan. To move the pieces around. That's what God, he just moves pieces around with the events of history. This happens to cause that to happen. This happens to move this person over there. We're all being moved by the things that happen around us. So now there's a famine. And now Yaakov sends his sons down to Mitzrayim to get food because he hears there's food down in Mitzrayim, down in Egypt. And they go down there. And it says that Yosef, he sees his brothers bow down because they think he's the viceroy. They're being respectful. And that's what his dreams were all about. So he remembers his dreams and he recognizes his brothers, v'lo hikeruhu, but they don't recognize him. Of course they don't recognize him. The Talmud says, why? Because when he left, he was clean shaven, no beard, right? But now he's got some kind of like probably weird beard, you you look at the pharaohs in the museums, and that wasn't their type of beard, but he had no beard before he left. Second of all, probably wearing, Egyptian clothing and it was 22 years later, so it changed somewhat in that period of time. They didn't recognize him. That's what it says. And then it says again, then what happens at the next is maragli batem. He accuses them of being spies. You are spies. That's what he says. And then again it says that Yosef recognizes his brothers, and then the story starts to unfold. And they try to clear their name, and the whole thing. It's all there in the Chumash. We're not going to go through the whole story right now. But they didn't recognize him. The question is, why does it mention twice that Yosef recognized them, and they don't recognize him? Why twice? Because once takes place before he says Meragli Matem, before he accuses them of being spies, and the second one takes place after he accuses them of being spies. Why is that significant? Well, think about it for a second. You go to a store to buy something. You go to your local 7-Eleven or Makolit here in Israel, and you walk into the store, and you're looking at there's the person behind the counter, and they even smile, and you put the thing down, and they tell you how much it is, and then you pay the price, and the exchange and all that, and you walk out. Uneventful. Everything goes exactly as expected. How long will it be after leaving the store that you'll forget the face of the person you saw? And maybe even the name if you saw their name tag. Not very long, because that doesn't, you don't try and put that in the long-term memory because it's such an uneventful thing. So it's not really, and at some point then you forget the whole thing entirely. Oh yeah, I remember once I went to a store to buy that, but you have to fight to get that memory back. But if you go into a store to buy something, right, and the person says, well, that'll be $10.65, and you reach and you realize you forgot your wallet. Now you're embarrassed. There's a whole lineup of people behind you. I'm sorry, I forgot my wallet. You have a credit card? I forgot my credit card. Or you have a credit card, right? And you give it to the person. It says, I'm sorry, it's declined. Now you're feeling like one of those people who either stole the cars. Like, very embarrassing, right? And you walk out. You probably won't forget that one for a long time to come. You might laugh about it later on, but the event, something strange and bizarre happens, and it catches our attention. Just think about the things you remember 25, 30 years down the road that stand out in your memory like it was just yesterday. And it's always because something stood out at the moment that caught your attention and said, hey, pay attention. So the first time when Yosef's standing before them conducting a business deal, they're coming in to buy food, they don't recognize him because they don't have to. Who cares? He's just a man standing there selling us some wheat. We're going to come, we're going to go, and we'll forget about him, and hopefully he'll forget about us. And then Yosef says, Maragli matem. Basically saying, look at me. Pay attention to me. He's changing the atmosphere. He's changing the mood. He's trying to get them to focus and look at him. And we mentioned before, Maraglim itself, all the letters which means spies, actually have their own words. Maraglim stands for Mimi Rachel Gematim, Mejanim Yishmael Mechartim. For my mother, Ruch, you stole me. Then you sold me to Arabs and to Midianites, down to Mitzrayim, Egypt. He's given them clues the entire way. We're not going to rehash the whole story over here, but we see, Yehuda says he knew the beds. And eventually Parshas V'yigash, Judah stands before Yosef, who's now going to keep Binyamin against his word, and says, come on, enough is enough already. You're driving us mashugana. It's like this crazy. Do we want to marry your daughter? Do you want to marry your sister? Why all the questions? Why all the shenanigans? Why all the shtick? And he's prepared to go to war because, like, enough is enough. It's like the coronavirus. Enough is enough already. Please, give me a cure, whatever it is. It's like, I want out. And the entire time. So when it says the second time the brothers don't recognize him, it's not because he looks different, but because their mindset, the way they're looking at the world, the way they're understanding. You see, if at any point in time, and they actually say this, they actually listen to their words and took their words to heart, they say to Yosef at the end of Miketz, has nothing that we didn't steal, nothing to do with you. God, we have a debt. We stole Joseph. We did things we shouldn't have done. He's waited until now to pay us back, and now is payback time. And that's what's going on over here. Not because Binyamin stole it, but it's payback time. This is what God's way of getting back from us some of the suffering we caused to our own brother and our father along the way. That's what pay attention to your words. Listen to what you're saying. If God's doing all of that through Yosef, then maybe even put Yosef in power. That's what the second not recognizing Yosef means. That if they'd only said to themselves, there's no way that Yosef become viceroy of Egypt unless, of course, God made him viceroy of Egypt, then everything's possible. If he had these dreams of grandeur, of royalty, he was preparing himself to be a king one day, to be a leader, right? And he had dreams to support it. Even our father interpreted his dream as being someone who's going to rule over everybody in the end. So, as the expression goes, yesh reglaim l'davar. There are legs for this thing to stand on, and you just see the hand of God and all. I tell Yosef. You have to be. I don't know how, but you have to be Yosef. But lo hikiruhu, they didn't recognize him, and then he reveals himself finally. Out of exasperation, he has to reveal himself because Yehuda is not getting. He's not getting the message. Brothers are not. Yehuda, 1 second. Can we just discuss this? What? Just now. It sounds crazy. I know it's like really weird and so outside the box. But as they say, if you limit all the logical possibilities, and all that's left are the ones that don't make sense, and usually that's the one that works in the end. So, what if? Just what if that somehow Yosef rose to the top and became this guy, because that would really explain everything, wouldn't it? That would only be possible if God did it, of course, because there's no logical reason, no natural reason why that would happen. But then again, God's doing a lot of strange stuff right now, and maybe. Taka makes a lot of sense what you're saying, and then you start to have a paradigm shift, because once you start entertaining the possibility, so then your mind starts to work it out. It's amazing how that happens. I'm always amazed to see how something seems impossible to me until I start to think about it. And all of a sudden, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about, and your solutions just start to pop up. Now, it's all divine providence. There's no question about that. But your mind and the heart have to work together. In fact, this is one of the things I said about Bilam. Bilam was called a prophet that was equal to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses himself, okay? But anybody who reads the story of Bilam, like, this guy is a crackpot. I mean, he may talk to God and may know a lot of things, but this guy is a lunatic. I mean, who in their right mind talks to God and God says, don't do that, and he goes and he does it anyhow? Who does that? I mean, come on, But it says that's the power of connecting the mind and the heart. The difference between Moshe and Bilam was that Moshe and Bilam both knew, they both were high up there. But the difference is that Moshe's heart listened to his mind. So therefore he acted on his knowledge. Bilam didn't let it happen. He had too much arrogance, too confusion, arrogance, desires, whatever it is, all those biases that get into our way of thinking that block up the heart like cholesterol, spiritual cholesterol, that does not allow what's up here to make it down to here. And that's when you start changing, you start looking at things differently, like what happened in World War II. Because in the beginning, a lot of people, thought you're nuts if you left. It was bad as it was. And then, of course, the situation got worse, and less people thought you were nuts if you left. And eventually, the people who thought you were nuts, who didn't get out, were jealous that you got out, right? And no longer called you nuts, but heroic and lucky and fortunate that because they got stuck. It's, our mindset changes based upon what we're prepared to allow into our perception. So that's why Yosef cries. Yosef says, if at this point in time you still have a difficult time seeing the hand of God in every last, when I say see the hand of God, I don't just mean up here where you talk about it in the class but like down here, you see the hand of God with your heart, because then you will act according to that. So some people are talking right now, they look at the situation as it's unfolding in the United States of America, and they're talking about leaving and making Aliyah, where 10 years ago they weren't, because they feel very threatened. They feel scared, nervous because of the policies and the approach. And you have to understand, it doesn't necessarily mean that evil people are getting to power and are deciding to do evil and become evil dictators. It's not that. It doesn't have to be that. It's because what they think is right is very different than what the Torah thinks is right. The people who are implementing what they think are right are not people capable of living up to higher standards of morality that allow checks and balances to make sure that what they're doing is in line with what God wants with creation. They're not even concerned about that. That's not the issue. But that's not even the point. That's not the point. That's what the Torah is trying to tell you, right? That the reason why the exile in Egypt had to be, and as severe as it was because we don't see so clearly how God is the one making it all happen. We're looking at the people and their personalities. We're looking at the parties and their policies. We're looking at the track record, but all that goes out the window once God has an agenda. And he always has an agenda. But the question is, where is that agenda holding right now? And we're talking about a history that's written up in the very second verse of my celebration, if not the first verse. And even before that, for that matter, according to Kabbalah. We're in the year 5781. That means nothing to some people, but everything to others. There's only supposed to be 6,000 years of history, folks. Right? That's what the Talmud says, and Kabbalah backs it up. You don't believe it? Okay, what can I tell you? Why don't you believe it? Because you know better, or because you haven't investigated? So investigate, find out. It's hard to believe. It's incredible. I can't. Fine. That's that's the way it works with all ideas. Doesn't mean it's wrong. Doesn't mean that No, but you have to check it out, because if someone's saying that, and it's based upon some type of source, there might be something to it, and it's going to impact us. Because one thing that's always concerned me, it goes back years. I wrote a book back in 1985, 86 called The Unbroken Chain of Jewish Tradition. And the whole point of the book was basically just to show how the Torah tradition is unbroken, going back to Mount Sinai. So what we have today is the same thing. But I decided to expand the project and to look at different aspects and facets of Jewish history, one of which, of course, was anti-Semitism. Just made sense. That was a major player in Jewish history, so why not address it as well? I knew about the Holocaust, I knew about pogroms and things like that, and I knew about the Romans who destroyed the temple, but not that much more. So I actually was given a book called Anti-Semitism, the Causes and Effect of a Prejudice, by a friend of mine who was actually giving a seminar on anti-Semitism. And I borrowed the book, and it's just a factual book. It's not like a philosophy book. It's actually written by a Jew and a Gentile together, not a religious book whatsoever. It's just an cursory overview. I call it cursory, but overview of the history of anti-Semitism going back to the Second Temple era. I began to read it to be able to put the facts down into my timelines that I was doing in this book, and it totally changed my life. I mean, I could not read it in several sittings. It was just too much factual information about death and dying, and if you do something like that long enough, all of a sudden your brain starts to play with the material, and questions start to arise and perspectives start to develop without even consciously doing it. And one question that started to pop up in my mind that really began to nag at me was that it seemed that every exile ended pretty much the same way. And these were factual events. These are not midrashim. This is going back to temple times when Josephus, he lived and wrote down history. We're just talking back then, but even you go back even earlier, even more so. But then there were prophets. It was a little bit. But since 2,000 some odd years ago, and the temple was destroyed, it was the same pattern. Everywhere we went, it was pretty much the same thing. We come in, we settle down, we have nothing. We're second-class citizens, to say the least. But we use a little ingenuity, and survival, is necessary, and necessity is a mother of invention, and all those things, and we develop. And it takes time, sometimes more than others in different places, and we build up communities, and we start to prosper amongst ourselves, and we have to expand, and maybe if history allows it. There are periods where we could not, and periods where we could, and then eventually we become successful enough that we start to move out like we did in Egypt, and and we start to assimilate, etc., etc. And it might even be a golden era like there was in Spain for a period of time, and boom, it all falls apart. Blows up on our face. Not like, it's been nice, King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella. We've had a great run over here. Oh, yeah, we also enjoyed having you here. Take care wherever you go, right? And, keep in touch. We will. We're going to Israel right now, and it'll be a whole different lifestyle. But, we accomplished so much when we were here. Oh, you certainly did. Goodbye. No. And they were friends of ours for a while. Then some priest comes into power and convinces them otherwise. The next thing we know, we're being exiled from Spain. And just one after the other, one after the other, one after the other, the same thing, same type of pattern, nuances of difference. And I was bothered, like, why is it? Why does that pattern have to repeat itself? And when I asked it, it was back in 1985, 86, at a time that the Jewish people didn't have to deal with things like this so much that we're going through right now with all the questions that are arising. And it turns out it's really a very, well, I don't want to say simple answer, but it's a pretty straightforward answer. And that is, people don't believe. They don't believe because they don't take the time to learn Jewish history. They don't take the time to understand what the game plan is for the Jewish people. Some people just start even earlier. They have to go back. They don't believe in Torah at all. So if you don't believe in Torah at all, you don't believe in the Jewish people. Not anything special. I mean, just some ethnic group. But there's a lot of people saying that it's more than that. So why? Why would they do that? And are they mentally stable? If they're mentally stable, it must mean something. So where's they getting? Check it out. Just check it out. Get to the bottom line. Because once you go through it all, once you accumulate that information, the historic information, the midrashic information, the even Kabbalistic information, if you can, and the factual, and you just put it all together, and just like as if you're putting it into a computer. And just say, computer, what should I do based upon all this information? And the computer is emotionless. Just no emotions, no biases, just facts, information. And the computer will spit it and say, "Get out, leave." Now, why? Because this is a pattern that's repeating itself. We have different points in history. Point A is where we're standing right now, and it changes in every generation. But point B is pretty fixed. Point B is the destination, where you have to go, where the Jewish people are headed. Again, you don't believe in it? What can I tell you? Check it out. But if you do believe in it, or you believe that you should believe in it, right? You just don't know exactly what it means. It's this thing. It's this thing where basically we have to get to this, the Jewish people living in the land of Israel, that the world recognizes God, because we speak about this every day. And that may sound like just a religious fanatic, but it's not. That's why creation was made. Check it out, right? And the Jewish people have to, be living by Torah. That's ultimately, at least those who survive, right? That's the way it has to end. That's the end game for history. That's from a Torah perspective. And we're over here, point A, right? You're in Dallas, right? And you got to get to Fort Lauderdale. There's a point, but you can't just snap your. You have to go through a process, go to different states and all that, or from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or back, whatever the case may be. These are two different points on a timeline. And where we're standing right now, and where we have been standing for the last couple of years, is pretty distant from that point B. And there's different ways of getting there. You can basically a massive kiruv movement, outreach, teach the whole Jewish people why Torah is true, and everybody becomes accepting of this, and they do the best they can to live by it. And then they understand Israel's the place to live, and we all pick up and move over here, and all the Gentile nations go, good. We're happy for you. It was nice to have you. You know, that's a possibility. And some people think it's still going to happen. And believe me, I'd be grateful if it did. But that's not usually the way it pans out. Because you look today, even when there was somewhat of a tshuva movement, it didn't get everybody. It got a lot of people miraculously, and it was fantastic. And you have to keep trying. You have to keep trying, but not at the end of the day, it kind of like faded out somewhat. You know, that lost interest. The world changed, whatever the reason is. And as far as Aliyah goes, well, we even have people today who are fighting against the existence of the Jewish state. And even amongst our own who accept the idea of a Jewish state, but not today because it's being run by, we're not there. We're just not there. And that's the point B. So how are we going to get there? Well, how did we get there in Europe? And how did we get there in Spain? And how did we get there in any place we were when that exile came? How did we get there? It always came down to one thing. We could no longer live where we were. The situation became so dramatic. Oh, but how can it ever become that extreme? What do you mean? They were asking the exact same question a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years in advance of it becoming that extreme. Because, and here's the bottom line, you have to understand. You have to know Yosef. But what does it mean to know Yosef? So the Talmud says, right there, or actually the Medrash says right there, when Yosef says, Ani Yosef, I am Yosef, he reveals himself to his brothers. Interesting enough is that the Medrash uses this to teach us that, this thing, that's going to happen also on a person's day of judgment. What will the day of judgment consist of? God saying to the person, Ani Hashem. Just like he said, Ani Yosef, he's going to say, Ani Hashem. And that will be the whole judgment. Why? Because that will show you that it wasn't the viceroy. It was always Yosef. Just likewise in our life, it was always God. The guy who delivered the package, the guy who stepped on our toe, the guy who hit the back of our car, the guy who wrote our paycheck. It was always the hand of God, but we got so distracted by everything else. Coronavirus, and it's all part of the distraction. It's all the hand of God to move things, move the pieces around. Look what happens in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. Moshe goes down in the name of Hashem. And Pharaoh says, Mi Hashem. And by the end of the 10 plagues, he's not asking that question anymore. No. He knows exactly. A drink break. He knows exactly who Hashem is. And God says, I took you out. I did all of the spectacular light and sound show that everybody should know that I am God, I run the world, and there's nobody else like me. That's all part of recognizing Yosef, so to speak. It's really recognizing Hashem in every aspect of it. So, don't be fooled by the events of today, the chaos taking place. On the contrary, pay attention to it. This is Yosef, or God saying, look at me. I'm trying to get your attention to tell you it's time to think about the bigger picture, the larger picture, the ultimate plan of the Jewish people. Don't get distracted by what everyone else is getting distracted by and get pulled into it, in the politics, etc., etc. Understand, I'm moving us, the nation, in the direction of point B. If you want to wait until the very end, that does not usually work out very well for the Jewish people. So, not what you expected, and I know that people are really fidgety. I was certainly fidgety. Fidgety having to listen to such a message, but it's a historic one. And I'm only telling you about what's happened for the last couple of thousand years. We can either learn and respond or wait to see how things play out. It's a gamble, right? Maybe it'll be different this time. They asked the same question also, but one thing is for sure. God has a fantastic way of masquerading what he's doing. So don't just use your own seichel, your own mind, and your own sense of hope to justify not making changes you have to make. There are times to adapt, and there are times to change. And quite frankly, this is probably the time to change. So I wish everybody clarity that we should be the ones that we should merit to recognize Yosef. In other words, to see the hand of God in all this taking place, and therefore make the decisions that even the hard ones have to be made, the right ones, to this time of all the times in history, to get it right finally at the end and not have to go through disastrous end of history.
Thank you. I always
Thank
tell
you. I
people
always
that
tell
it's
people that
better
it's
to
better to
be
be a
active
active
participant
participant.
than a bystander in the redemptive process. So it's people's opportunity to take charge and to take their lives in their own hands, and to become active participants in the process. So anyone who wants more information about that process, there's two sites that I would like to recommend. The first is Rabbi Winston's site, which is 36.org. Over there, you can find a list of his books for sale, as well as his shiurim, his lectures, and his webinars. You can also go to YouTube, youtube.com/Israel Torah. Please subscribe over there and click the bell for notifications so that you can be notified when we have these live webinars on a weekly basis. And finally, those that are able to go to israeltorah.org, it is a site of Bring Them Home, a site that is dedicated to encouraging Jews from around the world to return back home to their home. I think that's perhaps is the most difficult part of what we're living through now, that the vast majority of Jews don't even realize they're Jewish, and then even the ones that realize they're Jewish don't realize where their home is. So we hope that it will not be forced upon them. It'll arrive in an easy way. Thank you very much again for Rabbi Winston's very, very interesting topic of recognizing Yosef. And we hope to hear from you next week. Same time, same place.
Good one.
Thank you very much.